And before this video begins, I'd just like to give a special thank you to my Asbantium level patron, Fallon Cortez. Thank you for supporting the channel. So everything around Doctor Who is really heating up now as we eagerly await Series 14 to arrive and bless us with our first actual series of Doctor Who in 3 years. It's been a long wait, but we've become very accustomed to such long periods without Doctor Who. Naturally, most fans suggest spin-offs to fill the gaps during these periods, and the so-called Whoniverse, introduced by showrunner Russell T Davies, seems to indicate an official desire to adopt such an approach, creating a connected universe much like the show previously had during the first Davies era. Of course, this is a very exciting prospect, something a lot of fans are very much looking forward to, but recently my friend Joe Brennan made a great video about the reality of this Whoniverse approach and the many ways Doctor Who's creative team can get it wrong if they aren't careful. It's a fantastic video and I highly recommend checking it out. However, I think there's still a lot to be said and explored about the Whoniverse spin-off approach, especially when it comes to the different types of spin-offs that could make things fresh and unique in a standalone way. So today I wanted to take a look at the goals of the Whoniverse, the shortcomings of its contemporaries, and how it can justify its existence and even potentially propel Doctor Who to be bigger than ever. So join me for a deep dive into Doctor Who's spin-off problem. So in old J-Boy's banger of a video, he called out Davies' backseat showrunning before he came back to Doctor Who, and I agree that it's now on the showrunner himself to actually deliver on a lot of the spin-off ideas he teased years ago when he suggested Doctor Who needs a bevy of colourful spin-offs like the Nyssa Adventures. It was very easy for Davies to sit there like us and list all the things Doctor Who should do, but it's a lot harder for him to put his money where his mouth is now that he's actually in a position to do it. It's kind of like how you always get politicians talking about all the very important popular policies they'll definitely implement, only for them to conveniently forget all about them the moment they get elected. As Joe says, it's time to finally address the universe part of the term, Whoniverse. Shared universes are all the rage right now, but the closest thing to a spin-off in the current era is Tales of the TARDIS, which definitely shouldn't count. If a spin-off can be a bunch of characters sitting there for like 4 minutes either side of a Doctor Who story from 50 years ago, then you may as well count CBeebies bedtime stories too. Doctor Who spin-offs have always been the same kind of thing. As pointed out in the video, as good as Sarah Jane Adventures and Torchwood might be as either side of a Doctor Who demographic spectrum, they're very similar and somewhat derivative, with an alien cops approach defending the Earth from aliens and monsters who are always evil and a threat to deal with. I very much agree in this regard. The Whoniverse is stuck in this situation where Earth has to be the centerpiece. Despite the main show being able to go anywhere and everywhere, spin-offs have to have a more specific setting because they're more traditional conventional shows with set casts. From a budgeting and casting point of view, Earth is the easiest setting in which to ground a spin-off show. This has led to every existing and fan-suggested spin-off basically being the exact same concept. You have your ragtag group of Earth heroes and all sorts of evil aliens, with everything reverting to the status quo at the end of each episode. A single show like this would be fine, but Doctor Who would be doing itself a big disservice if it cemented this as its own status quo, because there's an entire universe to play with out there, rather than endless alien cop shows. A big part of the video that I actually heavily disagree with is the assertion that spin-offs can't change Earth too much, with the suggestion that integrating aliens or alien culture makes Earth too unrecognisable and lessens the impact of invasions because the world being threatened doesn't feel like our own one, like it does in the main show. I think it's quite reductive to think that audiences can't relate to an Earth with creative liberties. I mean, the show already has stuff like Torchwood and Unit, so fans can easily suspend disbelief to still feel the relatable threat of an invasion, despite it not being a one-to-one replica of our own reality. As long as a story is good, fans will enjoy it. There have been so many hints of Doctor Who's Earth having a future where humans live alongside aliens and Silurians, so I think it could be really interesting to have a Whoniverse-wide period of Earth's history where there's some alien integration into society. Maybe have a companion from 50 years in the future so there's some leeway and you can build that up as the central Earth for that period of the show. There's nothing to say that the Whoniverse absolutely has to centre around present day Earth. There have been all sorts of successful shows set in Earth's future, like The Expanse and Altered Carbon, so Doctor Who could easily ground itself in such a landscape for an era and a spin-off without damaging the fabric of the wider show. Doctor Who's infinite time and space setting is more of a curse than a blessing. I can definitely agree to that. When every episode is set on a different planet, a different period of history, or an entirely different reality, it's hard to distill it all down to a single setting. Because how do you choose the right one? Most of the ideas aren't built for longevity, but I think the video's dismissal of the example of the farm in the Doctor Falls is a bit unfair, honestly. As I've already said, if a story is good enough, fans will accept it regardless of setting. A proto-Cyberman invasion of a colony ship could be a fantastic premise for a Walking Dead style show exploring the characters and the ever-present threat of these relentless faceless creatures. Give that a solid ensemble cast, some great writers and like an AMC budget, and you could have a huge hit on your hands, completely divorced from the wider Doctor Who show. And it's all from an idea established in a cold open of a Doctor Who episode. The universe is just that versatile. Obviously, the biggest obstacle to a spin-off like this is the fact that Doctor Who isn't a powerhouse IP like a lot of fans think, but that can change with time, opening up the possibility for very different spin-offs like this that appeal to entirely different audiences that would otherwise never give Doctor Who a chance. Fans often back themselves into a corner when it comes to a spin-off, usually just wanting Doctor Who, but slightly different, as emphasised by Joe himself. It's always the single character bridging approach we've already seen multiple times, which is very much redundant. Even taking a character like River Song, who can freely move through space and time, just leads to River Song Who. To use the same example as Joe, Andor. This is a show that tells an actual, genuinely good and interesting story first, and simply places an existing character within it because it makes sense to. The workflow is the exact opposite to what Doctor Who has always done, and Andor should absolutely be studied by the Doctor Who creative team when it comes to justifying a spin-off's existence and use of an existing main character. Reject all the fan favourite ideas like the Nyssa adventures or the Paternoster Gang mysteries, and get real wacky with it by prioritising settings that need to be explored, stories that need to be told, and pushing the envelope with creative genres. Big Finish used to be great with that kind of stuff, although these days it's falling into the same traps of not being very unique or experimental itself. There are so many interesting ideas ripe for the picking if there's a true creative vision, and not just glorified fan service.
I'm not going to sit here and make spin-off suggestions of my own.
Well, I am. Doctor Who spin-offs can and should be completely different from Doctor Who. It doesn't have to be like Holby City and Casualty, or the many police and emergency services shared universes created by Dick Wolf. Yes, that's actually his name. These things are basically all the same show, but slightly different, with like one show based on cops and the other on a hospital in the same city, for example, because it's all grounded in reality. But Doctor Who doesn't have that same forced limitation, and fans shouldn't box it in like that. It's a versatile show in which you can do literally anything. I know Class was a failure and most people don't even know it existed at all, but I feel like it was the most unique, high-ceiling spin-off because of how loosely related it was to Doctor Who. The loose link wasn't the main reason it failed. It died because of a lack of support from the BBC, and could have become a really successful thing in its own right if there had only been some slight changes and more backing. You know, not throwing it on BBC Three on iPlayer back in an era where that wasn't really an important thing to do. There's so much power and potential in simply branding things as being from the world of Doctor Who and letting them be their own distinct thing, simply using some licensed elements to keep it connected and otherwise being very hands-off. Think of the idea of sister shows like Eureka, Warehouse 13 and Alphas coexisting through crossover episodes, forming a loose universe despite each show being very different and having different goals and different audiences. Or maybe look at Millennium being a retroactive X-Files spin-off. It didn't start life that way, it was simply made by the same creator before the show was wrapped up within an X-Files episode, therefore folding Millennium into the X-Files universe despite them again being different shows. Doctor Who has so much potential for this kind of universe. Shows that are related but not required for each other to exist and can take on completely different lives and forms of their own. And before anyone tries to be disingenuous, I'm not recommending just taking any show and just slapping the Doctor Who logo on it. Obviously there would be more elements that do cross over, but again it would be much more hands-off and allowing it to breathe and have its own audience without needing them to watch Doctor Who. I know heavily interconnected shared universes are all the rage now thanks to the MCU, DCEU and Star Wars. These are very literal cinematic universes where you have to constantly follow new media and watch everything to fully understand what's going on. I don't like this approach. I don't like having to look at a spreadsheet of every random TV show I need to watch to understand a new supposedly standalone movie. It's definitely an approach that has come back to bite Marvel, so it's absolutely not what Doctor Who should be trying to emulate because it dilutes quality and enjoyment. Instead, each spin-off should be approached as a standalone project with ties keeping it linked to the main show. Let's look at the Remedy connected universe of games, for example. The game Alan Wake references the earlier Max Payne games, along with sowing the seeds for what would eventually become Control, the current centerpiece of the connected universe thanks to the titular Federal Bureau of Control. Control and Alan Wake are similar but very distinct and different games with different standalone narratives, but they clearly exist within the same universe. Remedy director and Giga Chad Sam Lake has even explained that each game in the RCU is standalone, but also a doorway into a larger universe with exciting opportunities for crossover events. You can play Control and enjoy all the references and plot threads you notice, seeing how it connects to Alan Wake, especially in the DLC, but it's not necessary. You can play Control without even knowing Alan Wake exists and you will still have a great time, nothing changes. So it works perfectly for both casual and hardcore fans. It's the same with Alan Wake 2. Despite it featuring a lot more explicit crossovers and references to Control, it's still completely standalone and gives you all the necessary context you need to know. So even if Control didn't exist, you still get the full story. Shows like Sarah Jane Adventures and Torchwood aren't nearly as standalone in this way, so Doctor Who could very much benefit from this approach, creating very distinct standalone experiences with deeper connections that eventually thread together to form a universe that occasionally crosses over without falling into the same pitfalls as most cinematic universes tend to do. It's not unusual for shows to try very weird and experimental spin-offs. We've actually seen it quite often over the years. Baywatch infamously had a short-lived companion show called Baywatch Nights, where David Hasselhoff investigated sea monsters and aliens. Pretty Little Lies of all things had a spin-off where actual real ghosts and spirits existed, and it was all paranormal despite, the main show just being about a teenage girl faking her death for increasingly ludicrous reasons. Even Happy Days, the nostalgic 1950s Americana throwback sitcom that inspired the music video of Weezer classic Buddy Holly, had a 4-season-long spin-off centered around a literal alien guy played by Robin Williams. Casual 1950s stuff. And somehow that's not even the weirdest Happy Days spin-off, since there was apparently an animated show about the Fonz with time travel and a Scrappy-Doo sidekick. Casual 1950s stuff. I guess that means Happy Days is Fonzie Who now? And yeah, look, I get it. All these spin-offs were pretty awful and didn't work, so they don't exactly inspire much confidence in Doctor Who pushing the boat out with lots of experimental genre-bending spin-offs of its own. However, there have been some good examples, like Trapper John MD. This was a serious medical drama spun off from the comedy MASH, lasting for a whopping 7 seasons and only sharing the main character with its source material and barely ever referencing it. It didn't try to be MASH but in a hospital. It was an entirely different thing, and it clearly worked. So, what kind of unique spin-offs could Doctor Who play around with to really shake things up and experiment with genres? Well, how about an animated anthology series for past Doctors? It would give old Doctors the chance to have new on-screen adventures without overshadowing the main show, and also giving them the chance to have stories the show's budget never allowed them to at the time. But that's just Doctor Who again in animation. How about something a little bit further out from the core? Well, to again go for the more obvious fan favourite approach, you could have a Legends of Tomorrow style ensemble show about the time agency as they travel through time righting wrongs. Of course, that's again just like Doctor Who, but as an ensemble with a whole team, it would feel distinctly different. It's the same with my personal favourite idea that I came up with, not to brag. A Star Trek style show where a group of pioneer Time Lords explore the universe in the early days of Gallifrey. Similar, again, yes, but very different enough to stand on its own. Okay, let's get a little bit further from home. An animated anthology series in the style of Star Wars Visions could be really interesting, telling creative stories within the world of Doctor Who without needing any familiar characters. And to get even further out from the original show in its genre, you could have a gritty military political drama showing Davros' ascent and rise to power on Skaro long before the creation of the Daleks. There's definitely an audience for a story like that even outside outside of Doctor Who. Other shows could simply use settings from Doctor Who, like a New Earth-centric show, or a Peladon miniseries like Big Finish did, or how about one-shot anthologies like Tales of the Walking Dead. Lastly, they could take advantage of licensing, giving A24 the rights to make a proper, terrifying Weeping Angel horror movie without even the slightest mention of Time Lords or a TARDIS. Put us in the world Doctor Who was created, kind of like all the BBV stuff from the 90s, but actually good. Or, give us a Cult of Scarrow sitcom as they try to adjust to the wacky world of 1930s New York. Yes, no, this is a joke, okay? As Joe points out in his video, shows don't need to be multi-series network TV shows like they were back when Sarah Jane Adventures was dominating CBBC. There's been a big push towards limited series, to the extent that even Knuckles from Sonic has his own 6-part streaming event apparently. As weird as this stuff all is, you do just kind of have to embrace it and understand that it leads to many opportunities for Doctor Who, like my theoretical Rise of Davros show, which couldn't be an entire 8-season show, but would probably work as a very short, contained thing. However, this is also a very dangerous game to play because people like to see shows and characters evolving as a long-term project. It's how they stay in the public consciousness for longer, stuff like Breaking Bad and Better Call Saul. They developed and created huge fan bases over a long, protracted period of time and weren't just short things thrown onto a streaming service that people immediately forget about a year later. Not everything needs to be a 6-hour movie, but it is also a format that can be used very successfully, and I think the video discounted that approach too quickly. Take Doctor Who's own past, for example. Children of Earth is a fantastic 5-part, 5-hour experience. It's an entire series of Torchwood that's self-contained. You can pretty much just hop into it without needing much of series 1 or 2, and when it ends, you don't have any loose threads necessitating another series. It's the exact kind of experience that would thrive with modern media trends, showing a dark corner of the Doctor Who universe for exactly as long as it needs to, without having huge implications on the main show or lasting too long. So it's a format that can definitely be applied successfully to Doctor Who as a media property. In an ideal world, we'd still have traditional spin-offs with multiple series, cast changes, and an evolution throughout, but we would also have the occasional limited series event telling a specific story that's too long to be a movie, but also too short to be a 10+ episode series. They can coexist as part of a wider shared universe, and that's exactly the balance the creative team should be striking to keep the Whoniverse alive and encourage discussions when the main Doctor Who series isn't airing. Just like the so-called glory days of 2006 to 2010, when there was always something Doctor Who related going on screen. To piggyback off one last point in Joe's video, spin-offs are a great breeding ground for new talent. They allow for more distinct stories to be told in the world of Doctor Who, with different singular voices with creative visions exploring different experiences. Class was helmed by Patrick Ness, whose young adult angst and coming-of-age stories don't suit the main Doctor Who show, but absolutely work for a teen audience seeking something a little bit different within the same universe. Stuff that doesn't work in Doctor Who specifically can still work within the wider Whoniverse and actually increase the show's appeal by introducing it to entire new audiences through a spin-off suited for them. We also saw with Torchwood Series 1 and 2 that spin-offs can serve as a great way for writers to develop showrunning experience. Chibnall, for all his many writing flaws, is a good example of this. He was head writer on Torchwood Series 1 and 2, which eventually helped him to showrun Broadchurch, in turn landing him the job of showrunner of Doctor Who as a whole. Regardless of what you think of his stories or creative direction, you can't deny he's living proof of a Doctor Who spin-off to showrunner pipeline being a viable long-term strategy for the show as a whole. Just because he didn't have a hugely successful era doesn't mean that it's a bad concept entirely. We're still very early on in the second Davis era. We're unlikely to be getting any kind of news on future plans until at least Series 14 has finished airing. There have been unofficial confirmations of an anthology spin-off about Doctor Who monsters, starting with The War Between Land and Sea, which is all about sea devils and Silurians. Whilst I personally couldn't care any less for either of these species, it's the exact kind of experimental spin-off I champion, because it's very different and helps to emphasise the idea that all these things are happening at the fringes of the Doctor Who universe. Of course, they'll probably just throw in UNIT and make the whole thing another Alien Cop style show, but I really hope Davis is clever with how and when he uses spin-offs to craft this so-called Whoniverse. It's a difficult maze to navigate, especially in an admittedly niche media property fans tend to believe is valued a lot higher than it actually is. But if Doctor Who can succeed in building a successful American audience and Disney Plus greenlights lots of spin-offs, I hope we get ones that actually make sense and create a helpful, sustainable ecosystem for the show. I don't want to have to watch the Mel Ventures to understand the Series 14 finale, or Series 15.5 to understand Series 16 like you had the Book of Boba Fett. I really hope Doctor Who doesn't fall victim to that whole Mandoverse approach because it really drags everything down. But a short political drama series here and a galaxy-spanning exploration procedural there could really help flesh out the universe of Doctor Who and capitalise on its endless potential. Literally any show ever made could conceivably fit within Doctor Who because the property is that expansive and that flexible. Any genre, any tone, any length, it all has a theoretical place somewhere, and I hope the creative team can understand that as a bigger picture rather than continuing to play it safe by reskinning shows that worked 14 years ago. I just think there's a goldmine waiting to be unearthed, and I really hope it happens. Because, just to be honest, I just always want more Doctor Who content. But of course, I equally hope it ends up being good. Anyway, what are your thoughts on this spin-off conundrum? Which shows or genres do you want to see? Let me know in the comments. Thank you very much for watching, and as always, I'll see you in the next one. Bye bye. And I'd just like to give an extra special thank you to my Asbantium level patron Fallon Cortez, my Diamond level patron Glenna Clark, my Platinum level patrons Matthew Burns and Maximilian Foreman, and all my Gold level patrons Daniel Shillito, Francois Nako Line Vortex, Lee Marie Farrell, Thomas R, and Thomas Price. Thank you so much for your support.